The transport shuttle descended through the amber clouds of Prime, carrying its cargo of new recruits toward the most prestigious military academy in the known galaxy. Inside the cramped passenger hold, creatures of a dozen different species sat in organized rows, their eyes bright with anticipation and nervous energy. Among them, pressed against the cold metal wall near the back, sat Cole. He was 43 years old by Earth standard counting, though his weathered face and the silver threading through his dark hair made him appear older. The scars that marked his hands told stories that his quiet expression refused to share. Around him, the younger recruits chattered excitedly in various languages, their translators creating a constant hum of overlapping conversations. Simply watched the window, his eyes tracking the approaching towers of the Galactic Combined Forces Academy as they emerged from the clouds like fingers reaching toward the heavens. Beside him, a tall creature with scales that shifted between blue and green depending on the light, leaned over to get a better look. His name was, and he had spent the entire journey trying to engage the silent human in conversation. "First time seeing the academy?" asked, his forked tongue flickering with excitement. "I have studied the architecture for years. The central spire alone contains more training facilities than most planetary defense networks." Nodded without turning his head. "It's impressive." "You do not seem very excited," observed, tilting his head in the characteristic gesture of curiosity. "This is the greatest honor a soldier can receive. Admission to the academy means you have been recognized as exceptional among your species." "I suppose it does," replied. Before could press further, the shuttle lurched as it entered the academy's landing sequence. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing their arrival in the clipped, efficient tone common to military communications. Around them, recruits began gathering their belongings and straightening their uniforms. Stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He reached for the simple duffel bag that contained everything he had brought with him. No ceremonial items, no family photographs, no mementos of home, just the basic necessities and a small, worn journal that he kept in his jacket pocket. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and bright sunlight flooded the compartment. One by one, the recruits filed out onto the landing platform, where a reception committee waited to greet them. Hung back, allowing the eager young soldiers to push ahead. He had learned long ago that there was rarely any advantage in being first through a door. The academy grounds stretched out before them in carefully manicured perfection. Buildings of white stone and gleaming metal rose in ordered formations, connected by covered walkways and open courtyards. Everywhere looked, he saw species from across the galaxy moving with purpose and discipline. Drill instructors barked orders at marching cadets. Vehicles hummed overhead on predetermined flight paths. The entire facility operated like a precisely calibrated machine. At the front of the reception area stood a massive officer, his 4 arms folded across his barrel chest as he surveyed the new arrivals. They were known throughout the galaxy as the galaxy's premier warriors. Their species had evolved on a high-gravity world with scarce resources, and they had developed into natural fighters. This particular specimen stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin like weathered stone and eyes that burned with barely contained aggression. "Welcome to the academy," he announced, his voice carrying across the platform without any apparent effort. "I am senior instructor. For the next 18 months, I will be responsible for transforming you from whatever pathetic examples of military competence you're considered acceptable into soldiers worthy of the Galactic Combined Forces." He began packing along the line of recruits, pausing occasionally to examine one more closely. His gaze lingered on a warrior whose ceremonial armor gleamed with embedded crystals. He nodded approvingly at a pair of twins who stood at perfect attention, their cybernetic enhancements visible beneath their skin. When reached, he stopped. For a long moment, he simply stared down at the human, his expression unreadable. "What is this?" asked, not bothering to hide his disdain. "A human, I was not informed that we would be receiving any humans this cycle. There was a last-minute addition to the roster, a junior officer supplied, checking his. Transfer from Earth Defense Forces, Specialist Cole. Lips curled back to reveal rows of serrated teeth. A specialist? How amusing. Tell me, human, what exactly do you specialize in? Methus gazed without flinching. Survival, he said simply. A ripple of laughter spread through the assembled recruits. Even some of the other instructors exchanged amused glances. The however did not laugh. He studied with renewed interest, though his expression remained contemptuous. Survival, repeated. A modest ambition for someone seeking admission to the most elite training program in the galaxy. I suppose we should be grateful you did not claim to specialize in breathing or walking. More laughter did not react. Moved on, continuing his inspection of the recruits. When he had finished, he returned to the front of the group and launched into a lengthy explanation of academy procedures and expectations. Listened with half an ear, his attention focused on cataloging his surroundings. Exit points, defensive positions, potential threats, old habits that no amount of peacetime could break. The orientation continued for several hours, covering everything from dormitory assignments to academic schedules. Was placed in Barracks 7, one of the older buildings on the campus. His roommate was a young named, who regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disappointment. I was hopping for a roommate, admitted as unpacked his meager belongings. Or at least I have heard that humans are not very, he searched for the right word, impressive. We managed, said. The first few weeks at the academy established a pattern that would define his experience there. In every class, every training exercise, every evaluation, he was consistently ranked at or near the bottom of his cohort. Not because he failed to complete the assigned tasks, but because the instructors had developed a habit of dismissing his performances regardless of the actual results. During a tactical simulation exercise, led his team to achieve every objective with 0 casualties, only to receive a below-average grade because his strategies were deemed too cautious and not sufficiently aggressive. In hand-to-hand combat training, he defeated 3 opponents in succession using a combination of techniques that none of the instructors recognized, only to be lectured about relying on unconventional methods rather than proven martial forms. Even in the academic portions of the curriculum, his papers received poor marks despite being factually accurate and well-reasoned. The feedback consistently criticized his lack of proper theoretical understanding, though it never what exactly he had misunderstood. The other recruits quickly learned to avoid associating with the human. His reputation as a failure spread through the academy faster than any virus, and those who had initially shown curiosity soon kept their distance. Only the from the transport shuttle occasionally sought him out. I do not understand, said one evening as they sat in a corner of the common area. You complete every assignment, you pass every test, yet your scores are always among the lowest. Shrugged, the evaluations are subjective. They are supposed to be objective, protested. That is the entire point of the standardized assessment system. Systems are run by people, observed, and people have biases. Shook his head in frustration. Does it not bother you to be treated so unfairly? Considered the question for a moment before answering. I have been treated worse. There was something in his tone that made Fall silent. For all his youth and idealism, there was perceptive enough to recognize that he was speaking to someone who had seen things beyond his comprehension. The Academy's biases against humans were not entirely without basis in history. Humanity had only made contact with the galactic community 70 years earlier, and their integration into the larger civilization had been rocky at best. Compared to species that had been traversing the stars for, humans were viewed as primitive newcomers whose technology and military capabilities were laughably inferior. The fact that humanity had successfully defended Earth against two separate invasion attempts by species that should have conquered them easily was generally attributed to luck, defensive advantages, and the attacking forces underestimating their opponents. The idea that humans might possess any genuine military competence was dismissed as propaganda designed to salvage human pride. Senior instructor made no secret of his contempt for his human student. He took every opportunity to use as an example of inadequacy, calling him out in front of the class to demonstrate what not to do, assigning him the most difficult partners in sparring matches, and publicly questioning his presence at the academy. "The human is here because of politics," declared during one particularly brutal session. "The combined forces wish to appear inclusive, so they accept token representatives from lesser species. It would be a kindness to dismiss him now, before he embarrasses himself further." Stood at attention, his face expressionless as the insults washed over him. He had learned long ago that reactions only encouraged bullies, whether they were human or alien. But something changed during the 6th week of training. The academy received word of a developing situation on a nearby colony world. A group of insurgents had seized a resource extraction facility and taken workers hostage. Normally, such incidents were handled by local security forces, but the insurgents were unusually well equipped and had already repelled 2 rescue attempts. The academy's leadership decided to use the crisis as a training opportunity. A team of advanced cadets would be sent to assist the local forces, with instructors observing to evaluate their performance in a real-world scenario. It was exactly the kind of high-profile mission that every recruit dreamed of. When the team roster was announced, was not surprised to find that his name was not on it. What did surprise him was the addition at the bottom of the list, added almost as an afterthought. Support personnel, Specialist M. Cole, Logistics. He was being sent as a supply handler, responsible for maintaining equipment and running errands for the real soldiers. It was an insult wrapped in an opportunity, a chance to fail publicly in a way that would justify his eventual dismissal. Packed his gear without complaint. He had never been particularly concerned with what role he was assigned. In his experience, roles had a way of changing once the shooting started. The transport carrying the mission team departed at dawn, heading toward the colony world at maximum velocity. Sat apart from the others, reviewing the mission briefing on his, while the combat team discussed strategy and jockeyed for position. He noted several concerning elements in the intelligence reports. The insurgents' equipment was too advanced for a simple rebel group. Their tactics suggested professional military training, and the facility they had chosen to seize just happened to house an experimental power source that could theoretically be weaponized. None of this was reflected in the official mission assessment, which characterized the operation as a straightforward hostage rescue against a lightly armed criminal element. Finished his review and closed the. He had been in enough bad situations to recognize the smell of one approaching. Whatever was waiting for them on that colony world, it was not going to be the simple training exercise the academy expected. The question was whether anyone would listen to his concerns before it was too late. He looked around at his fellow soldiers, young and eager and supremely confident in their own abilities. They had trained for months in state-of-the-art facilities, mastering techniques developed by the greatest military minds in the galaxy. They believed themselves ready for anything. Had believed the same thing once, before reality had taught him otherwise. Now he simply checked his equipment, confirmed that his weapons were properly maintained, and settled in to wait. War had a way of revealing the truth about people, and the truth was often nothing like what they expected. The colony world of 7 appeared on the transports as a sphere of and brown, its surface by decades of industrial extraction. Mining operations had stripped away much of the original vegetation, leaving behind a landscape of processed rock and artificial structures. The facility they were approaching sat at the center of the largest mining complex, a hardened bunker surrounded by open ground that offered no cover to anyone attempting an assault. Lieutenant, a young who had been appointed to lead the cadet mission team, studied the tactical display with growing concern. He had expected the operation to be straightforward, a chance to demonstrate his leadership abilities and secure a favorable position upon graduation. Instead, he was looking at a fortified position that would challenge even experienced soldiers. The briefing indicated that the insurgents were lightly armed, said to the instructor accompanying them, a veteran named Commander who had been assigned to observe and evaluate. Intelligence assessments are based on available information, Commander replied. His tone suggested that he was not surprised by the discrepancy. Combat situations are fluid. Adaptability is expected. The transport touched down at a forward operating base 3 kilometers from the target facility. Local security forces had established a perimeter, but their morale was clearly shaken. Watched as the cadet team disembarked with their weapons and equipment, noting how the local soldiers regarded them. The expressions were not those of people seeing their rescuers arrive. They looked like people watching more lambs being led to slaughter. Approached one of the local officers, a weathered woman with cybernetic implants covering the left side of her face. She was directing the positioning of defensive barriers with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. "How many rescue attempts?" asked quietly. The officer glanced at him, taking in his logistics designation and dismissing him almost immediately. But something in his eyes made her pause. "3," she said, "2 official, 1 unofficial by family members of the hostages who thought they knew better, all failed. Casualties: 17 dead, 22 wounded, another 12 taken hostage." She turned back to her work. "Your academy friends should be careful. Whatever is in that facility, the people holding it are willing to die to keep it." Nodded and moved on. He found a quiet corner near the supply depot and began unpacking the equipment he had been assigned to maintain. While he worked, he listened to the tactical briefing being conducted for the cadet team. Lieutenant had developed an assault plan based on standard military doctrine, a frontal approach with heavy suppressive fire, followed by a breach of the main entrance and a room-by-room clearance. It was textbook strategy, perfectly executed in theory. It was also exactly what the insurgents would be expecting. Considered speaking up, offering the observations he had made during his review of the intelligence data. But he had learned during his weeks at the academy that his input was not welcome. More importantly, he had learned that people rarely listened until they had no other choice. The assault began at dawn the following morning. Watched from the forward observation post as the cadet team advanced toward the facility. They moved in precise formation, their movements coordinated and professional. The academy's training was evident in every step, every gesture of tactical communication. The first explosion came when they reached the 200-meter mark. Someone had buried improvised explosive devices along the approach route, triggered by pressure sensors too sensitive for standard detection equipment. The lead element of the assault team was caught in the blast and saw 3 cadets go down immediately. The insurgents opened fire from prepared positions that had not appeared on any reconnaissance imagery. Heavy weapons platforms emerged from concealed bunkers, laying down a field of fire that forced the remaining cadets to scatter. Lieutenant was shouting orders, trying to rally his team and salvage the assault. But the plan had been compromised from the first moment, and now he was reacting rather than leading. His commands contradicted each other as he tried to process information faster than his training allowed. More explosions, more casualties. The cadet team was being systematically dismantled by an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. Commander grabbed a communication unit and called for immediate extraction. Whatever this mission had been intended to prove, it was now a disaster that needed to be contained before the entire team was lost. The transport arrived under heavy fire, its shields flaring as it touched down long enough to collect the surviving cadets, helped load the wounded aboard, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. He had seen worse. He had been in worse. When the transport lifted off, 7 cadets remained behind. 4 were confirmed dead. 3 were missing, presumably captured by the insurgents. The flight back to the forward operating base was silent except for the sounds of the wounded. Lieutenant sat apart from the others, his hands shaking as he tried to process what had happened. His first real command had ended in catastrophe, and the weight of that failure was crushing him. Commander was already composing his report, his expression grim. The mission had been intended as a training exercise, a controlled introduction to real combat operations. Instead, it had become a massacre. Stayed with the wounded, doing what he could to stabilize them until proper medical attention arrived. His movements were practiced and efficient, suggesting experience that went far beyond basic first aid training. "You have done this before," one of the wounded cadets observed, whose left arm had been badly burned. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were sharp. "Yes," said simply. "How many times?" Did not answer. He finished applying the burn treatment and moved on to the next patient. Back at the operating base, the surviving team members were debriefed by Commander and the local security commanders. The assessment was brutal. The insurgents had demonstrated capabilities far beyond what the intelligence suggested. Their weapons, tactics, and coordination indicated professional military training, possibly from one of the major powers that officially maintained neutral relationships with the combined forces. The hostage situation had escalated. The insurgents now held 3 additional captives from the academy itself, a political complication that transformed a local security matter into an interstellar incident. "We need to attempt another rescue," Commander declared. "But this time, we go in with accurate intelligence and proper preparation." "With respect, Commander," Lieutenant said, his voice hollow, "we have no assets capable of conducting that kind of operation. The cadets are too inexperienced, and the local forces have already failed multiple times. Then we wait for reinforcements from the academy or request support from the combined forces command." "That will take days," the local security commander interjected. "Perhaps weeks. The insurgents have already demonstrated willingness to execute hostages. We cannot wait that long." The argument continued for hours, going in circles as each participant advocated for their preferred course of action, while acknowledging that none of the options were good. Sat in the corner of the briefing room, ostensibly reviewing supply manifests, but actually studying the tactical information that had been compiled. The patterns were clear to anyone who knew how to read them. The insurgents were not random criminals or ideological extremists. They were professional soldiers operating under a unified command structure. Their equipment was standardized, their tactics were coordinated, and their defensive positions had been prepared with military precision. More importantly, they were protecting something specific. The experimental power source mentioned in the original briefing was not just valuable, it was dangerous. In the wrong hands, it could be converted into a weapon capable of devastating entire cities. Understood now why the insurgents were willing to fight so hard, and why outside powers might be secretly supporting them. This was not a hostage situation. It was an arms race disguised as a local crisis. He stood up and walked to the front of the room. "I can get them out." The conversation stopped. Every head turned toward the human logistics specialist who had just interrupted a high-level strategic discussion. Commander stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "Specialist Cole, you are here in a support capacity. Return to your station. With respect, Commander, the hostages will be dead before reinforcements arrive. And the longer this situation continues, the more likely it becomes that the power source will be removed from the facility and transported to whoever is backing these insurgents. And you believe you can succeed where trained combat teams have failed. Met his gaze without flinching. I have done it before. Impossible, Lieutenant interjected, his shame at his own failure making him hostile to anyone who suggested they could do better. You are a logistics specialist. You ranked at the bottom of every combat evaluation at the Academy. The Academy evaluations measure adherence to standard doctrine, replied. They do not measure effectiveness in unconventional situations. Commander studied him for a long moment. Something in the human's demeanor had changed since they arrived on the planet. The quiet, unassuming figure who had accepted every insult and poor grade without complaint was gone. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone whose calm confidence suggested experience that the Academy records did not reflect. What exactly did you do before you came to the Academy, Specialist Cole? I served in Earth Defense Forces. In what capacity? Paused before answering, classified. The local security commander leaned forward. I have access to Combined Forces intelligence archives. If you give me a moment, I can pull your service record. You will not find anything, said. The records are sealed at the highest level. Then how are we supposed to trust your capabilities? Reached into his jacket and his worn journal. He flipped to a specific page and placed it on the table. The page contained a list of dates and locations, written in neat handwriting that had faded slightly with age. These are operations I participated in during my service. You will recognize some of the locations. Others you will not, because they were never officially acknowledged. Commander scanned the list. His expression shifted from skepticism to shock as he recognized several of the entries. The Battle of Meridian Station, the Extraction, the Silent Week. Events that had shaped galactic history, attributed to unknown forces or unexplained circumstances. Operations that should have been impossible. These are classified events, said slowly. How would you know about them? Because I was there. Silence fell over the room. The other officers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to believe the human's claims or dismiss them as delusion. If what you say is true, the local commander said carefully, then you are not a simple logistics specialist. I am whatever I need to be. Lieutenant shook his head. This is ridiculous. We cannot base our strategy on the word of a human who claims to have participated in events that may not have even happened. Turn to face the young. How many of your team are still alive because of the medical treatment I provided during extraction? Hesitated. The answer was at least 4. Had stabilized casualties that should have died from their wounds, using techniques that were not part of standard academy training. I am not asking for your trust, continued. I am asking for an opportunity. If I fail, you lose nothing except a logistics specialist that you never valued anyway. If I succeed, you get your people back and you prevent a dangerous weapon from falling into hostile hands. Commander stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting over the landscape of 7, casting long shadows across the mining facilities. Somewhere in the distance, the target facility sat waiting, its secrets guarded by enemies who had already proven themselves capable and ruthless. He thought about the 3 cadets currently being held captive, young soldiers whose only crime was being assigned to a mission that had been from the beginning. They deserved a chance at rescue, even if that chance came from the most unlikely source. What do you need? Asked finally. Allowed himself a small smile. Access to your equipment stores, complete tactical data on the facility, and 12 hours to prepare. You intend to go alone. One person can move where a team cannot, and I work better without distractions. The decision was made over the objections of Lieutenant and several other officers. Was given everything he requested, along with a communication unit that would allow him to signal when the hostages were ready for extraction. As he prepared his equipment in the quiet of the supply depot, found him. The young had been among the wounded, his scales still discolored from the burns he had received during the failed assault. "They say you volunteered for a suicide mission," said. "They say many things. Is it true, what you told them about your past?" Paused in his work. He looked at the who had shown him kindness when everyone else had dismissed him, and he decided that honesty was warranted. "I have been a soldier for most of my life. Not the kind they train at academies. The kind they send when everything else has failed, when the situation is too dangerous or too politically sensitive for official forces. I have done things that I am not proud of, and I have seen things that I cannot forget." Then why come to the academy? Why submit to their evaluations and their insults? Resumed his preparations. "Because I was tired. I thought that if I could learn to be a different kind of soldier, the kind that follows rules and operates in the light, I might finally be able to rest. And instead they treated you like garbage. They treated me like what they expected a human to be. I cannot blame them for their prejudice. I can only show them that they are wrong." Watched as finished assembling his equipment. The human moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, checking each item with careful attention before stowing it in its proper place. "I hope you succeed," said finally. "So do I." At midnight, Cole disappeared into the darkness beyond the forward operating base, moving toward the enemy facility with the silent certainty of someone who had done this many times before. Behind him, the academy cadets and military officers could only wait and wonder whether they had just witnessed the beginning of a miracle or the end of a fool. The night on 7 was darker than most worlds, its polluted atmosphere blocking the light of distant stars. Moved through this darkness like a ghost, his footsteps silent against the processed rock beneath him. He had mapped the terrain during the approach, identifying safe paths that avoided the sensor networks and patrol routes that had caught the previous assault teams. The insurgents were good. They had established overlapping fields of fire, hidden surveillance devices, and layered defensive positions that would stop any conventional military approach, but had stopped being conventional a long time ago. He reached the outer perimeter of the facility at approximately 3 hours after midnight. 2 guards were stationed at a secondary entrance that the tactical data had identified as a maintenance access point. They were professional, alert, and armed with weapons that could cut through standard body armor like paper. Watched them for 7 minutes, learning their patterns. They rotated their attention in a systematic cycle, covering all approaches while never leaving any direction unobserved for more than a few seconds. Textbook procedure executed flawlessly. The problem with textbook procedure was that it was predictable. Waited until both guards were at the far points of their observation cycle, then moved. He crossed the open ground in a low sprint that brought him to the base of the facility wall just as the guards began rotating back toward his position. He pressed himself against the cold metal, timing his breathing to match the ambient sounds around him. The guards completed their rotation without detecting anything amiss, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before beginning his climb. The maintenance access point was located 15 meters above ground level, designed for servicing external equipment that could not be reached from inside. The wall offered minimal handholds, smooth metal designed to resist climbing, but had spent 3 years on a planet where the only way to survive was to climb cliffs that made this wall look like a gentle slope. He reached the access hatch in 4 minutes. The lock was electronic, connected to the facility's security system. A direct breach would trigger alarms throughout the complex. Studied the mechanism for a moment, then a small device from his equipment pack. The device was not standard military issue. It had been built by a human engineer named Sarah, who had died defending a research station against raiders 20 years earlier. Had kept it as a reminder of what humanity could accomplish when they stopped trying to match alien technology and started finding their own solutions. The device interfaced with the lock's control circuitry, feeding it false signals that convinced it the hatch was still secure while actually releasing the mechanism. Slipped inside and closed the hatch behind him without making a sound. The interior of the facility was a maze of corridors and equipment chambers, all designed with a specific purpose that became clear as moved deeper. This was not a simple mining operation. The experimental power source mentioned in the briefing was part of a larger weapons development program, one that had been hidden beneath the cover of legitimate resource extraction. Found the first group of hostages in a storage chamber on the facility's second level. There were 8 of them, including 2 of the missing academy cadets. They were bound and guarded by 3 insurgents who looked bored with their assignment. Boredom was fatal in situations like this. Waited until the guards had settled into their routine, then struck. The first went down before he could react, a precision strike to the nerve cluster at the base of his skull. The second turned at the sound of his companion falling, only to find already inside his guard. A brief struggle that ended with the guard unconscious on the floor. The third managed to raise his weapon, but had already closed the distance. A sharp impact to the throat followed by a controlled takedown. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 seconds. The hostages stared at him in shock as he cut their restraints. One of the academy cadets, a young whose cybernetic implants had been damaged during capture, found his voice first. "You are the human logistics specialist," he said, disbelief evident in every word. "How did you?" Later interrupted, "Can you move?" "Yes, but there are more hostages." The insurgent leader took 3 of them to the power core chamber. He said he would execute them if anyone attempted a rescue. Had expected this. Hostage situations always had complications, and leaders who were willing to die for their cause were often equally willing to kill for it. "I will get them. You take the others to the maintenance access on level 2, west side. Wait there until I signal for extraction. You cannot go alone. The power core chamber is the most heavily defended position in the facility." Checked his equipment and confirmed his weapons were ready. "I have been alone most of my life. I know how to handle it." He left to organize the other hostages and moved toward the center of the facility. The corridors became more heavily guarded as he approached the power core, requiring him to use every skill he had developed over decades of infiltration operations. At one point, he encountered a patrol of 4 insurgents moving in tight formation. There was no way to avoid them without risking discovery, and no way to engage them without alerting the entire facility. Chose a third option. He triggered a minor system malfunction in a nearby junction box, drawing the patrol's attention long enough to slip past them in the opposite direction. The power core chamber was located at the exact center of the facility, protected by reinforced walls and a security door that required biometric authorization to open. Through the observation window, could see the 3 remaining hostages kneeling on the floor. Standing over them was a male in military-grade armor, his ceremonial blade drawn and ready. This was the insurgent leader. His posture and equipment suggested he was not a common criminal or ideological extremist. He was a professional soldier, probably special forces from one of the powers that publicly condemned such operations while secretly funding them. Studied the situation. The door could not be breached without alerting the leader. The observation window was reinforced against weapon fire. The ventilation system was too narrow for entry. Standard approaches would result in hostage deaths before he could neutralize the threat. He needed to be unconventional. Removed a small container from his equipment pack. Inside was a biological compound developed by human scientists during the first alien invasion of Earth. It had been created as a last resort weapon, designed to incapacitate enemies while leaving humans unaffected. The formula had been refined over the years and carried a version that would work on most known species. He attached the container to the ventilation intake for the power core chamber and activated it. The compound would take approximately 3 minutes to reach effective concentration. In that time, he needed to keep the leader's attention focused on something other than his hostages. Moved to the security door and knocked. The leader's head snapped toward the sound. Through the window, could see confusion fighting with training on his face. No one should have been able to get this far into the facility undetected. The knock suggested someone who wanted to be noticed, which made no tactical sense. "I want to talk," called through the door. No weapons, no tricks, just a conversation. A long pause. Then the leader's voice filtered through the door's communication system. "Who are you?" "My name is Cole. I am a specialist with the Galactic Combined Forces Academy." A human. The contempt in the voice was unmistakable. The Academy sent a human to negotiate with me. "They did not send me. I volunteered." Another pause. Watched the compound gauge on his wrist unit. 2 minutes remaining. "Why would you do that?" "Because I understand what you are protecting, and I understand why you are willing to die for it." The leader moved closer to the door, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Could see him more clearly now, and he recognized the insignia partially hidden beneath the leader's armor. Imperial Guard, supposedly disbanded after the last war but actually operating as a deniable special operations force. "You know nothing about our purpose," the leader said. "I know that the power source in this chamber can be converted into a weapon capable of destroying cities. I know that your government wants it for the same reason they want every other advantage over their rivals. And I know that if you succeed in getting it off this planet, millions of innocent people will eventually die." "Innocent?" the leader laughed bitterly. "There are no innocents, only those with power and those without. We are simply ensuring that my people have the power they need to protect themselves." 1 minute remaining. "I have heard that argument before," said quietly. "From every tyrant, every warlord, every leader who believed that the ends justified the means. They were all wrong." "And what makes you so certain you are right?" Thought about the years he had spent doing terrible things in the name of protecting humanity, the lives he had taken, the choices he had made. He was not certain he was right. He never had been. "I am not certain of anything," he admitted, "except that killing those hostages will not give you what you want. It will only guarantee that the cycle of violence continues forever." The compound reached effective concentration. Through the window, saw the leader's posture shift as the sedative began to affect him. The tried to raise his blade, but his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. He collapsed before he could harm any of the hostages. Entered the override code that he had extracted from the security system earlier, and the door slid open. He moved quickly, securing the unconscious leader and freeing the remaining hostages. The third Academy cadet, a female named Vex who had been considered one of the most promising recruits of her generation, looked at him with something approaching wonder. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it." "Not yet, we still need to get out." The extraction was anticlimactic compared to the infiltration. Led the hostages through the maintenance corridors to the designated exit point, where the first group was already waiting. He signaled for extraction, and within minutes a transport arrived to collect them. As they lifted off, looked back at the facility. The insurgents were regrouping, but it was too late. The hostages were safe, and the power source remained under combined forces control. Whatever plans had been set in motion would need to be abandoned. The flight back to the forward operating base was filled with questions that did not answer. He sat apart from the others, watching the sunrise through the transport's windows. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind the familiar exhaustion that always followed operations like this. When they landed, Commander was waiting. The officer's expression was complicated, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something that might have been shame. 12 hostages recovered, reported. 0 casualties. The facility is secured and the power source is being transported to a protected location. He paused. You accomplished in one night what multiple teams could not achieve in weeks. I had advantages they did not, said simply. What advantages? Experience, and the fact that no one expected anything from me. The returning hostages were debriefed over the following days. Their accounts of the rescue spread through the Academy cadet population like wildfire. The quiet human logistics specialist who had been dismissed as a failure had single-handedly infiltrated an enemy stronghold, disabled multiple guards, rescued 12 prisoners, and captured an enemy leader, all without firing a single shot. Senior instructor summoned to his office 3 days after the mission. The stood behind his desk, his 4 arms folded in a posture that suggested internal conflict. I have reviewed your service record, began. The classified portions were unsealed by Combined Forces Command following the operation. Weighted. 27 years of special operations, 43 confirmed missions, all classified at the highest level, direct participation in events that shaped the course of galactic history. His voice was flat, but something flickered in his eyes. You are one of the most decorated soldiers in human military history. Why did you come to the Academy? I already told someone that answer. Tell me. Considered refusing, but he decided that deserved the truth. I came because I wanted to learn how to be a different kind of soldier, someone who operates by rules rather than necessity, someone who builds rather than destroys. And instead we taught you that even the most prestigious institutions are full of prejudice and ignorance. You taught me that systems reflect the people who run them. That lesson has value. Was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its characteristic harshness. I owe you an apology. I allowed my assumptions about your species to blind me to your actual capabilities. That was unprofessional and unfair. Nodded, accepted. The Academy is offering you a formal commendation and an instructor position. Your experience would be invaluable to future cadets. I will consider it. The commendation ceremony was held 2 weeks later, attended by representatives from across the galaxy. Stood at attention while Commander read a citation that described his actions in terms that made him uncomfortable. He had never been fond of public recognition. But something had changed at the Academy. The whispers that had followed him through the corridors were different now. Instead of contempt and dismissal, they carried curiosity and respect. Recruits who had avoided him now sought him out, asking questions about techniques and approaches that were not covered in standard training. Found him after the ceremony, his scales bright with recovered health and something that looked like pride. You proved them wrong, they said, all of them. I proved nothing except that humans are capable of surprising people. That is exactly what you proved. Do you not understand what this means? For years, every species in the galaxy has assumed that humans are primitive, weak, inferior. You showed them that those assumptions are wrong. Looked out over the Academy grounds, watching the cadets move between buildings with purpose and discipline. Somewhere among them were the survivors of 7, carrying stories that would shape how their entire generation thought about humanity. One person cannot change how an entire galaxy thinks, said. No, agreed. But one person can plant a seed, and seeds have a way of growing into things that change everything. Accepted the instructor position. Over the following years, he trained hundreds of cadets from dozens of species, teaching them the lessons he had learned through decades of unconventional warfare. Not the standard doctrines that filled Academy textbooks, but the real skills that kept soldiers alive when everything went wrong. His classes became the most sought after in the Academy. Students competed for admission, knowing that what they learned would prepare them for challenges that no amount of theoretical training could anticipate. Graduation rates improved. Mission success rates increased. The Academy's reputation grew. And slowly, gradually, the perception of humanity began to shift. Other human soldiers followed its path, bringing their own unique perspectives and capabilities to the galactic military community. They faced the same prejudice that had encountered, but they faced it with the knowledge that someone had gone before them and succeeded. 20 years after his arrival at the Academy, Cole retired from active service. At his farewell ceremony, representatives from every major species in the combined forces gathered to honor him. The speeches praised his tactical brilliance, his innovative teaching methods, and his tireless dedication to developing the next generation of soldiers. But the words that meant the most came from who had become one of his closest colleagues over the years. When Cole first arrived at this academy, the old said, I dismissed him as a token representative of an inferior species. I was wrong. He taught me, and he taught all of us, that true strength is not measured by physical power or technological advancement. It is measured by determination, creativity, and the willingness to face impossible odds without surrendering. Turn to face directly. Humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the fastest, though, or the most technologically advanced, but they possess something that many other species lack. They refuse to quit. They adapt. They survive. And when everything seems lost, they find a way. Nodded in acknowledgement, accepting the tribute without comment. He had never been comfortable with praise, and age had not changed that. But as he looked out at the assembled crowd, seeing faces from species that had once considered humanity beneath notice, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The seed that had spoken of all those years ago had indeed grown into something significant. He packed his belongings that evening, preparing to return to Earth for the first time in decades. His journal, worn nearly to pieces after so many years, went into his bag along with a few other possessions he had accumulated. On the transport home, he opened the journal to a fresh page and began writing. Not accounts of missions or tactical observations, but something different, something personal. He wrote about the cadets he had trained and the officers he had served with, about the prejudice he had faced and the respect he had earned, about the long road from dismissed logistics specialist to academy legend. And at the end, he wrote a single sentence that summarized everything he had learned over a lifetime of service. The measure of a soldier is not how others perceive them, but how they respond when perception becomes reality. Cole closed the journal and watched Earth appear on the ahead. He was going home, not as the broken warrior who had left seeking redemption, but as something else entirely. A teacher, a legend, and proof that humanity, for all its weaknesses and limitations, had earned its place among the stars.